Hello, friends. My name is Namde Nake, and I host Nationhood podcast. Thank you for joining me. Our guest today is Patrick Okpaleke, a historian of health and medicine and a doctoral researcher at York University in Ontario, Canada. Patrick's interests include African history, the social history of health and medicine, and technology and environmental history. His current work is focused on the history of mining and how miners navigate health-related issues, mine accidents, occupational health, industrial pollution, and toxic legacies from industrial activities in Africa. Patrick associates with several scholarly gatherings, such as the International French Research Institute, the Lagos Studies Association, the Historical Society of Nigeria, and the American Society of Environmental History, amongst others. In today's episode, we will engage questions of health and medicine in Nigeria from historical, current, and future perspectives. And so, without further ado, I am honored to welcome Patrick Okpaleke to Nationhood Podcast.
Thank you very much, Anandi, and thank you very much to our listeners.
Yes, thank you for gracing the Nationhood Podcast. I am excited to hear you talk about health and medical history, and I believe listeners will also be enlightened. So let us begin with your background as a historian. Can you tell me what you find so fascinating about history?
So basically, one thing that really, strike me about the study of history is uncovering the past. And these are not just any past, but significant past, which shaped societies in time past.
Mm.
So there's a difference between the past and significant past. I find it very fascinating in the sense that uncovering those significant past holds a lot of lessons that can not only help us in the present time, but if applied appropriately, could also help us navigate into the future. So all through the years from my first degree through to my master's and currently on the research I'm doing in my doctoral studies, I have continued to, be kind of I've really found it very interesting, particularly when I go to the archives and pick, several pieces of documents that were written as far back as 1900, 1910. It gives me a glimpse of what societies were like in those days. And it also helped me to understand how we have arrived where we are today.
I couldn't agree more with what you've just said. And I'll tell you why. Sometimes I'm looking at archival materials, I'm reading through them, so maybe correspondence between one person and another, and it feels like magic because I'm just imagining, everything that like I'm there in that moment. You are participating in these conversations, or you're reading a report or something, and you can relate with what is going on there. It feels like you're a part of that. Obviously, a lot of elements that might be missing that, you may not relate with. However, I think I can connect with, that reason of how history has an allure, understanding the past, especially if you're also able to maybe apply it to say the present and maybe the future as well. So going a bit more specific, I know you're really interested in health and medical history. I'm curious to know what is so special about these areas compared to other parts of history.
Well, I don't think any subsection or discipline in history is more important than any other part. But I
Okay.
feel like first and foremost, one needs to really have a sort of flair, a sort of longing, and a sort of connection to a
Yeah.
particular sub discipline of historical scholarship for
Mm-hmm.
you to be able to navigate with ease. So basically, for me, I have always had this sort of connection to the social history of medicine because I feel like in a society, for a society to function properly, the citizens or the inhabitants needs to be in a good state of health. For you to talk about economic progress, it means you have a very healthy population. For you to talk about those who perform cultural activities, for you to talk about those who will probably do anything in a society using a functionalist theory, like, one part helping the other to function properly. There needs to be a sort of sound health in that society. And very recently, we've had a lot of conversations around climate change, global warming, and all this. And of course, they are very much connected with health. You can't disconnect these things. They are very much connected. So I have always had this flair for medical history, but I think my flair for medical history heightened specifically during the COVID. So a lot of things that played out in the COVID really, really made me think about some of the things I have read in time past through archival documents and other historical works. So we had a COVID, a pandemic that threw the entire globe into a state of pandemonium. But of course, that was not the first time the world was experiencing a pandemic. We also had a pandemic during the 1918, 1919 influenza pandemic, right?
Spanish flu.
And yeah, the Spanish flu actually created a lot of situations where there were so many social issues. Beyond understanding the etiology or the epidemiology of that particular pandemic, we also need to understand what was the social implication. How did people react? And I began to think about this deeply when we started seeing a lot of rumors, unconfirmed information, both from some of our religious leaders, from our, politicians, from people we really look up to, more or less, in the societies.
Mhm.
I have this very big books titled Plague and Pestilence. And I've read that book once, idea about, and I had to bring out the book. Bringing it out, I saw a couple of pestilences and plagues that have, really, really impacted humankind. And while I was looking through that, I went to the page where they had the Spanish flu, the Spanish influenza, right? And exactly what was playing out in that book was what I was witnessing or seeing in 2020 in Nigeria. And
Can you
even in
give
the
some
post,
examples just so
okay,
that we
so
can relate with them?
yeah. So basically, for instance, one of the major issues that really, really created a lot of challenges for colonial government, particularly in Africa, to handle the flu was misinformation. There were a lot of misinformation in different societies, but I will specifically talk about southeastern Nigeria or basically Lagos. So in Africa, we had this mindset of sometimes when diseases at large scale strike, we try to connect them to some sort of trad religious underpinning, or it's like a
Yeah.
punishment. But it wasn't just only African thing. I read Charles Rosenberg, The Cholera Years in America, and you could actually see the same thing playing out where the religious leaders, the church, were, giving national prayers.
It's a curse
And this
from
was,
God.
yeah, it's a cause from God. Basically, what we were saying was mankind have sinned so much that God is now beginning to punish man for his sins. This was in America during the 19th century. It wasn't in the 15th or 16th. And though we have similar things playing out in Nigeria during the Spanish influenza, where people thought if you had camphor in your pocket, you will be immune to the flu. And people thought probably if you do a certain ritual or the other, or even consult the native doctor, okay, you will be covered, you'll be immune. And during the COVID, we had cases of where people were talking about, oh, when you eat bitter cooler, or probably when you take a lot of garlic, you'll be immune. And we had pastors who were saying, oh no, there was nothing like COVID-19. What is actually happening is they are installing the 5G mask. So they want everyone
Yes.
inside the houses. So misinformation, rumors, as it were, during the 1918, 1919 period, also played out during the COVID-19. And in the post-Spanish influenza, for instance, we also had a lot of misinformation. Specifically, let me use an instance like smallpox, because I'm currently researching on smallpox. So during the time of smallpox in southeastern Nigeria, for instance, there were a lot of misinformation.
Yeah.
People felt like, oh, they're trying, particularly during the time of vaccination, people felt like, oh, they're trying to count us again so they could actually tax us.
Yeah.
Oh, no, you can't actually have me isolated. What will happen to my young man? There were a lot of issues. And during the COVID-19, there were also doubts because there were medical mistrust already. And people refused to take the vaccine because how is it that you actually brought up a vaccine in less than 1 year? Something struck. There's something we are
Yes.
not being told. And to make matter worse, they were like, even when you take the vaccine, you are not totally immune. It's just to reduce the effect of the COVID. So,
The
I
narrative
mean,
kept changing, right?
yeah, it kept changing. And these are some of the issues whereby a lot of people began to evade or refuse to be vaccinated because they felt
Mm,
like there was something amiss. And this was exactly what happened between 1910, when the first officially reported smallpox issue somewhere in Italy
mm,
was reported, and subsequently vaccination began around 1920, up until 1979, when Nigeria was finally declared smallpox free. A lot of people
mm.
were evading vaccination because they were not sure if getting the vaccination would actually keep them safe. So I think there's a connection and there's a lot we can learn from the history books to help us address certain issues with our health system in contemporary times.
Mm. That's amazing. From your publications, and I saw the paper you wrote about COVID-19 and the Akwa Ibom State experience. Maybe you can speak a bit more about that. But from your publications, which I know you have quite a number of, it's clear that a wide variety of topics attract your attention. So you've spoken about things like the health of migrant sex workers, social movements like the NSAS in places like the Niger Delta, national issues as well and so much more. I'm curious to know, how do you pick what to research? Hello, friends. I want to thank you for supporting Nationhood podcast. If you are watching this video and are yet to subscribe to the channel, please go ahead and do so right now. Our content is free, and by subscribing, you always know when there's something new. So go ahead and click the subscribe button now, and then let's get back to the video.
Yeah, basically, I actually had a training. Well, my kind of training during my master's, more or less, to the largest extent, determined most of what I have written. So during my master's degree program, I was trained as a social historian. And so basically for social historian, we are not very much limited to any particular um, kind of interest. We are trained to research things we find are very, very significant, which could actually offer some kind of lesson to the society.
Does that make you guys
Um,
activists in a way? Sorry to interject. While you can just add that while you're responding. Does that make you like some kind of academic activist since you are always looking for a social issue to talk about or something? I don't know. Curious.
yeah, not really like an activist because for the historian, we don't really recommend. So we are not activists. We
Mm,
only try to uncover similar events from the past
okay.
so the public or the audience can begin to see that, hey, this is not really new altogether, but it
Mm,
has happened before. So what were the lessons? What
yeah.
did we miss in the past? How can we avert similar pain? Because one thing I think I find very disturbing in terms of Nigeria specifically is I think we are yet to understand how we can push our society from the mistakes we have made in the past. It is
Okay.
everywhere, from the civil war, from the issues of environmental degradation, issues of public health concerns, to economic misfortunes, and also to religious intolerance. So we keep having this same thing playing out over and over without taking anything from them. And that is why I think some time ago, Professor Wole Soyinka said that history does not repeat itself, so to speak, but it is foolish people or stupid people who repeat history. So going back to the question of how I pick what I research,
Yeah.
um, it's not like I'm an activist, but I feel like sometimes when certain things are like of global concern, you can actually contribute to that ongoing conversation from your own point of view. And if you have seen my publications, I try to localize and I try to provide a sort of local flavor to global conversations by
Mm,
using regional, experiences. So
Mm,
I've done 3 publications with regards to the COVID. I did the first one that has to talk with issues of national security, because in Nigerian context, our leaders tend to understand national security as might, military
mm,
wise. If it is not
yes.
military getting the largest budget, it is definitely military getting the largest budget.
Mm,
Our health system has been suffering. There's little or nothing added to it since the last national health plan around 1970s. We've not really had a very, very tremendous addition to that sector. I also
mm,
did something that talks about palliative, unlike in the Western world where palliative are well organized and channeled down to the most vulnerables. What we
yeah.
saw during the COVID in Nigeria, for instance, is nothing close to the palliative in the real sense of the word.
Yeah.
Of course, you know the story, but I wouldn't want to belabor us with that details. But the recent publication is basically a sort of holistic view. I tried to, present a holistic view of what really transpired in Nigeria using the Akwa Ibom experience. And like we
Mm,
mentioned, myself and my co-author, we mentioned that the reason why this study is very, very important is because Akwa Ibom State is one of the highest statutory allocation earners in Nigeria.
that is
In fact,
correct.
if we go through the table in that article, we had to actually pull out the statutory allocation for the month of April. And Akwa Ibom State came, I think, about second. So the state had no reason why its citizens should suffer palliative defects. And also, we tried to pinpoint the fact that because of personal interest, we had a sort of clash, collision between health workers and political appointees. And these are not things we need in terms of large health threats. We need all
Right.
hands to be on deck, and we need everyone to synchronize, to synergize, and combat the disease. But whereby you have this sort of divided fronts, of course, you know what the implication will be. So I think that is it for that. All of my work, like the one about the NSAS issue and how it's spiraled into the Niger data, and also something that has to do with youth football. I'm one person that like to give voice to the youth, and that is why I also have a side interest, on things that have to do with youth studies.
Yeah.
Um,
I
yeah,
saw
if
your
you if you
paper
look,
on football in Ajegunle, the
yeah,
clubs
exactly,
and how they are
yeah,
making a change
that paper
compared to some
actually
other
got,
people's
yeah,
perspectives.
it got a honorable mention by Taylor Francis as one of the leading papers in
Mm,
2022 that is shaping the conversation on African studies. So basically, I tried to capture the situation of things in a slum area, Jegule. Like, I was born and bred there. I basically did a sort of ethnography survey, right? While I was also volunteering for a club back then. So I was trying to show how youth were beginning to navigate social vices and social issues through soccer. And if you piece that into what I did with NSAS, it's also like a sort of academic call to attention that the government needs to do better when it comes to the youth, because the youth are like the future of tomorrow. I don't know. So I think that was what I was trying to get at there.
yeah.
But with my doctoral research right now, I'm fully focusing on environment and health. Maybe
Okay.
in the future we can continue on other sub-disciplines.
Sounds really great. And there are two things that are raised by, the last comment you've made. Let me start with the first one.
Okay.
Relating to the NSAS article you wrote. I know you've just kind of like given an overview of what it's about, but you seem to be trying to make some, new arguments there because a lot of people are familiar with the power of Ajegunle, at least in Nigeria. It's not just soccer that Ajegunle
Yeah.
has been
Music.
identified with. Music is another one, and the overarching story, which you can correct me if I'm wrong, is that in spite of the squalor or, however this place is represented as the worst kind of slum, let me put that in quotes,
Yeah,
it still manages to produce these top talents who perform exceedingly well on a global stage, whether it's in music, in soccer, and what have you. But
exactly.
you also mentioned some other things. So tell me, what are the different arguments you are making there? What are you reinterpreting in that piece?
So for the answers, basically, what we did there was I did that work first and foremost with an associate professor in English and Literary Studies
Mm.
at the University of Calabar. So
Yeah.
what we did was basically I tried to specifically show that the Niger Delta region has always been submerged in social movements. So there's this subheading that has to do with old wine in new bottle. So
Yeah.
the argument I was trying to make there is social movements are not new to the areas. If you go back as far as 1885, during the Akasa raid, for instance, where the local community, you know,
They
rose
attacked the
up and
headquarters of the
yeah,
Royal Niger Company at Akasa.
exactly. So these are also part of social movements, and you agree with me that even in contemporary times, the Niger Delta region, with regards to resource nationalism and the fight for equity in terms of environmental issues that have really plagued the area, we've seen a lot of cases of social movement. So
Yeah.
the fact that what actually transpired in Lagos, Lekki to be precise, could have a spiral effect in the Niger Delta region is no surprise to some of us who actually studied history. From Calabar to Akwa Ibom. And the word Niger Delta there is used in a political sense. That is to say, all the states that produces oil
Well,
from Edo, Imo, we try to
Ondo.
capture,
Mm.
Ondo, we try to capture those areas and show how the youth reacted and
Mm.
what the government did in response. So basically, that's what we're trying to show. We're trying to show that social movements are not new. They've been there before. But how have the government over time learned to avert similar things that will always give the youth the opportunity to rise?
So is this a unique thing in Nigeria? I'm curious to know because it seems we have social movements literally wherever you go in the world, from the most developed to the least developed countries. So what kind of things do you think we could be doing differently?
Yeah, I think it was about Einstein who said that doing the same thing the same way and expecting a different result is like madness. Yeah, I
I've
think
heard
that
that
was what he
before.
said. Yeah, so you can't be doing the same thing the same way and expect a totally different result. And like I said
Mm,
earlier on, the Nigerian state, I wouldn't want to say the leaders, if we have one anyway. The Nigerian state, that is to say, both the politicians or the leadership and the followership, we need to start looking into how we can take advantage of historical scholarship. There's nothing new under the sun. The reason why the Western world is progressing is because they place so much value on their history. From their history, they're able to map a sort of doctrine or a policy that will shape their national activities, both for the now and in the present.
yeah.
So, in the case of Nigeria, I think one thing we can do is the government should begin to pay more attention to historical issues. For instance, we keep having this sort of ethnic bigotry. We keep having this sort of clash between the North, the South, this sort of North-South dichotomy. We
Or
keep having
religious
this sort of,
basis,
yeah,
Christian and Muslim, or
exactly. Just
Igbo
last
and
week, I think there
Yoruba.
was something that trended on the X. I don't know if you saw that.
Mm.
There was this sort of publicity in one area in Lekki where they said, "Oh, Jesus Christ is not God."
Yes,
Where,
like on the mosque or something, like on the
yeah,
wall of a
yeah,
mosque.
yeah. These are some of the things I think we are yet to learn. Not many people knew that the first civil strife, the first civil issue in Nigeria actually happened in 1945 in Plateau,
Mm,
Jos. I think that article was written by Leo Plotnikov, a
mm,
Russian scholar. He showed how there was a sort of clash between the Christian from
yeah.
southeastern Nigeria
Mm,
and the Northerners. Although he also argued that that clash was more or less instigated by the British government because they wanted to pay Nnamdi Azikiwe specifically some sort of, they wanted to teach him some sort of lesson for being a bone in their neck. But what I'm
yeah.
trying to say is that we've had series of cases of clashes from the colonial period.
Mm,
What have we done with these lessons? I'll give you a very quick example.
Of course.
In 1994, Rwanda became the cynosure of all eyes across the globe
Mm,
because of what? The issue
the
between the
genocide.
Hutu and the Tutsis, the
Yes.
genocide. But I don't know if you followed, because I've done a couple of reviews of books that talks about the genocide. You will see the approach, the sincere, genuine, honest, transparent approach the states decided to use in addressing the issue and ensuring that similar recurrence does not come up. Can we say the same for Nigeria?
I'm
Can we?
familiar with some literature I've seen about how in Rwanda it's almost like, and this is me just using my own understanding. It's almost like
Yeah,
an offense to describe people by their ethnic groups. Everybody in Rwanda is a Rwandan.
is a Rwanda. Yeah,
I'm not a
I was
Hutu. I'm
even
not
going
a
to say,
Tutsi.
I was even going to give you an example of a lady I met at the picket line the last time we went on strikes. She's
Mm,
from Rwanda, and when I asked her, "Oh, right," she was like from Rwanda. I asked her a couple of questions, but what I saw is her responses show this sort of nationalistic approach. There's no sectionalism like, oh, I'm a Hutu, oh, I'm a Tutsi. Like most Nigerians will, fall
mm,
short of like trying to identify. Yeah, of course, we've seen recently, oh, I'm a Yoruba, I have no business with the other part. These are the issues we've had in Nigeria. And the
yeah.
simple reason is because we are yet to take into cognizance the fact that, look, we have separate backgrounds, but how can we put all this into a single pot, merge them together, so we can have one united front? And my argument have always been that since we have a faulty or a sort of dysfunctional constitution that
Yeah.
have actually, secluded certain group and giving some sort of advantage to other group, it will remain a problem. It
Mm.
will remain a problem. So I think that is just my thought for that.
I think that's an excellent response, and I was going to bring up the issue of historical consciousness
Yeah.
further along the conversation. So I'm glad you discussed that right now. However,
Okay.
I wanted to ask you something about the way you work, given that um you have a varied range of interests, talking about youth, talking about health, like with COVID, talking about social movements as well. What kind of hats do you have to put on when you are engaging with different kinds of scholarship? Because it seems to me that even though it's social history you're doing here, each of these, topics falls within a different kind of, study area, if you like, with their own terminologies and specifications. Like speaking about medicine just now, you're talking about the etiologies and epidemiologies and all that, which someone who is not a medical historian or in that line will not understand. And so the point here is if you're going to be touching on topics across different fields and engaging with the arguments that are going on with the experts in those fields, it means you need to understand at least, to some level what their key arguments are about. How do you do that?
Personally, I think, like I said earlier on, training matters a lot. My master's program was very, very thorough and rigorous. Like I was asked to take quite a number of courses that speaks to different theme in historical scholarship. In fact, I actually remember I did something that has to do with slavery, emancipation movement, diaspora studies generally as part of my master's courses. And I also remember I did a course that really, really took me deep into education history, religious history. So I was really exposed to quite a number of things because the argument then was since you don't want to be an economic historian, you don't want to be a political historian, you want to be a social historian, you need to read wide. And I think another thing that helped me was I started building a library far back 2009. And last count before I traveled out, I had about close to 6,000 books. So I've read quite a number of books on
Mm,
different subjects.
mm-hmm.
And I think that also have really, really helped me in the way I conduct my research. Yeah, and I also I found that very helpful when I was preparing for my comprehensive exam, which I recently took, and
Mm,
I discovered that quite a number of the books I have read in time past also came up in the list. And also the
Yeah.
conversation was like a continuum, right? So I
Mm.
think reading broadly and also following what conversations are, at the top really have a way of helping you to write some of this research you have in mind. It may shock you to know that just recently I received, okay, I think one of the assignment I did during my master's that talks about how religion is also helping to contribute to national development in Nigeria.
Mm.
I actually sent that work out to a journal, I think Annual Review of Islam in Africa. Yeah, ARIA, that's the title of the journal. It's hosted
Mm.
by the Cape Coast University in South Africa. I actually forgot that I had such a thing because I sent it out just before the COVID. And with the COVID issue, post-COVID issue, and other issues,
Disrupted so much.
yeah, because I sent the last revised copy and it was accepted, and I totally forgot. It was just last month that it occurred to me that I actually have a publication over there. And when I wrote to the school, they actually sent me a PDF copy of the work published. And so, what is the work all about? The work is all about a particular religious group, an
Mm.
Islamic religious group, NASFAT. The short form is
Mm.
like NASFAT,
I know
and how
NASFAT.
they've been, and how they've contributed to national development by way of
Mm.
establishing a university, by way of having a sort of cooperative society where they actually support their members with loan,
Mm.
maybe to build house, for also embarking on pilgrim, or also, other things.
Yeah.
So basically, what I think when I was in my master's was when I really had this sort of broad idea about a lot of things I could work on as
Mm.
a social historian. By starting my PhD, I began to streamline my research to basically three themes: social history of medicine, environmental history, and the history of technology.
Interesting. So let's talk about your current research, particularly with respect to health. I know you're taking a look at coal mining in Enugu, and often when we think about the kind of hazards that miners face, it's usually things that relate to the dangers of their work, inhalation of carbon and risk of things like, respiratory diseases and other kind of, risks from equipment damage and what have you. But you also speak about things like sexually transmitted diseases and those other kind of risks. So can you really just shed some light on that, so that we get an idea of what this is about?
Yeah. So what I did with that particular article was to show how sex workers impacted coal mining production overall.
Mm.
And what was I trying to do? I was trying to show that a lot of the coal miners who moved to the coal fields, basically, of course, sex is non-negotiable, and a lot of them did not have their wife with them due to housing issue and overcrowding issue. So many of those men could not also come with their wives. So we had about a situation where five men had one houseboy, so to speak, who would actually attend to some domestic issues for them. But in terms of meeting the comfort of home, like Louise White have written
Mm.
in her book on prostitution in Nairobi, I actually showed how by engaging sex worker to, satisfy their sexual urges, they contracted some very dangerous diseases. Specifically, two diseases topped the list of my tables, and these were syphilis and gonorrhea.
Mm.
And how did I argue this out? So each time a particular coal miner contracts any of these venereal diseases, as they were called back then, they had to take a sick leave. And at some point, the number of people requesting sick leave who had contracted venereal diseases became alarming to the point that it started to impact on the workforce in the coal mines.
And this is being reported by the officials of the corporation, right? That
Yeah,
we have so
yeah.
and so
In
people who are
fact,
sick.
yes, yes. I in the work, it's just the publishers are yet to provide a soft copy for it, but I think the editor is working out something. So we actually have about 4 or 5 tables because very recently, I'm beginning to approach historical scholarship from a kind of new perspective in the sense that I like my work to also have numerical analysis or quantitative analysis. So when we talk about diseases, you should also, just like in environmental history or history of technology, we talk about scale, how large or how little did it impact morbidity, mortality. So for you to demonstrate and show clearly what your conversation is all about, you also need to include tables to show the diseases, frequency, the impact, and stuff like that. So in our table, we showed the number of workers, hours of work time lost, and the percentile, all those stuff. We were able to show this between 1941 and 1946. And it is instructive to note that that time frame was, instrumental or is significant in the sense that that was like during the World War II, right? So you can actually imagine the British government was executing a war as a major protagonist in the World War II. And the resources from the coup also helped support the execution of that war. And so the British troop, also being sent to different, region of the war. When they get infected, for instance, it affects, right? And because you now have less manpower, a lot of people have taken sick leave. It's also affecting the co-production process. So it became a problem and it became a concern for the British government. And I felt like it is important to discuss some of these because a lot of the conversations already on the coal mine have not paid attention to issues of health and environment. So I'll give you a very quick rundown of the literature in that dimension. One of the earliest literatures on the coal mine was basically the one written by Okpaleke, I think around early 1960s. And it was basically focused on the 1949 Ivar Valley incident or massacre, as many would know it as. And subsequently, there was also the Ugu, who also did similar thing, but showing us from a very different dimension.
And then Caroline Brown as well.
Yeah, Caroline Brown is like a major authority on the coal mine. And she focuses more on labor and social history in the sense that she was trying to understand issues of work, labor culture, and also how a lot of the slave traders converted or transformed into the earliest suppliers of labor at the coal mine. Basically, in fact, recently I read the entire book. We Are All Slave, African Miners and Culture in Enugu Government Colliery. So basically, there are a lot of, things that could actually be added to that conversation. And one of them is the issue of medical history, which she didn't really look at. And we also have Akachi Odemena, who did a work on Enugu, and he tried to use the coal mines, the coal fields, as a sort of centripetal force that attracted a large number of migrants into Enugu during colonial period. We also have this other work by one Chime Inji Deuka or something of that nature. Chime, he was actually trying to talk about British colonialism and the coal field, but basically he approached the race study perspective. So we haven't heard so much about issues that have to do with health, particularly how coal miners navigated issues of health. Remember, health could actually be public health. It could actually be sanitary issues. It could actually fall under epidemics, because of course, a lot of things happen at the coal camps. Overcrowding, deaths, they create a lot of problems for the people. And we've not really seen these conversations out there. And this is exactly what my present work is going to, be contributing to the broader conversation. I also intend to also cover the environmental, because you can't talk about health without the environment. So before the coal was discovered by Albert Kingston in 1909, what was the environmental landscape or the agricultural landscape of the region? How the prospecting of mineral, of course, originally it wasn't coal they were looking for. The mineral survey department was just trying to see if they can get gold and other, solid mineral resources until Albert Kingston stumbled on the subbitumen coal in 1909. And between 1909 and 1915, when coal production became a source of wage labor, what was the situation like? How did it lead to probably deforestation? How did it probably, created a sort of polluted environment for the people? These are things that we've not really talked about. And of course, like very similar mines in South Africa, we've seen where coal-related issue created challenges for not just the coal miners themselves, but for also those who were around that particular vicinity.
Yeah.
So that is what I
So
actually intend to look at.
quite interesting. So there's something you raised that I'm curious to know what your thoughts are about it concerning the colonial interest in the bodies of Africans. A lot has been written about it. People like David Arnold and some other people as well. Canonical authors. It's been
Yeah,
explored significantly. Both interest in the physical or the mental, like Matthew Heaton's work on black skins
psychiatric,
and
yeah,
yeah.
white
So
coats.
different ways. I'm just curious to know if this is something you engage with in your own research, the extent to which there is a colonial interest in the bodies. Is it just the economic aspect, or are there other ways in which this shows up? So, for example, if there are white laborers, no, they wouldn't be laborers, but white officials of
White
the
workers,
coal
yeah,
mines,
at the
white
coal mine, yeah.
workers, that's the more appropriate term. White workers and black workers who have the same venereal disease, are they getting the same kind of treatment, or are they being treated differently, so to speak? And maybe that's just a very random example, but broadly speaking, are you engaging that question in your work in any way, even if
Yeah, thank you very
peripherally?
much for that question, Nandi. I really appreciate that. In fact, it was one of the things I noted in my notes taking while I was reading a couple of books around that area. So we've actually seen quite a number of works that have really helped us to rethink the whole idea of colonial or Western biomedicine. And like Megavon would, talk about
Megan Vaughan.
Michael Foucault talks about
Hmm.
biopower, and also
Yeah,
even Franz Fanon also have given us some insight into colonial medicine and how
yeah,
it was used as a tool of subjugation and imperialistic disposition or drives. So I
yeah,
think what I intend to do is to see, like you've asked, how or what sort of medical infrastructure we are available for the African workers on the coal fields. That is one area I'm also interested in because based on my preliminary field work, I have come to realize that African workers who worked on the coal mine had no medical access until 1946 or 48 thereabout when the Enugu Colliery Hospital was established. So the question is, what was the situation like between 1915 when they began to employ labor, African workers, to 1940s? That's about 25, 28 years gap. A
yeah,
lot could actually happen in 20 something years. So what
indeed.
can we really say happened? How were miners assessing healthcare? How were they treated? What sort of, you know, interest did the colonial government or the managerial, the managers of the coal mine had towards the bodies of the African miners?
Yes.
So these are some of the questions. And remember that one of the reasons why the Ivor Valley massacre happened was not just because of specific wages, but also because of general improvement in terms of workers' welfare.
Welfare.
So there were a lot of accidents, there were a lot of exposure to hazardous, items, challenges, coupled with the fact that they were poorly paid.
Mm.
There was this article, I keep forgetting the name of the author, which is also another very good lead for me to show that the Enugu coal fields or the colliery was not fully mechanized up until 1976. So basically, a lot of things being done there were done manually.
Manually.
We've not accounted for a lot of this. And this
Well, I've
is
seen
why
some
I'm very
pictures
much
where they had
interested.
some
Yeah.
tracks, at least some real track,
Yeah,
you
that
know,
is why
some
I
annual
said
reports which they will use to
not
push
fully
the.
mechanized. In fact,
Yes, it
if you
was
go online, you will
semi-mechanized. Yeah.
see I used that picture because I also got that image. Two
Mm,
guys, pushing on the conveyor, right? I used
mm,
that image when I applied for a little pre-dissertation fund in from Harvard University, and
mm,
it was part of the image I sent when they were, trying to put up our
yeah.
title and abstract on their page. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So it was not fully mechanized. We would actually see other places where people were still using baskets to
To
also
carry
convey
things.
food.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's
So
correct. That is
it wasn't
correct.
fully mechanized until 1976. We can
Mm,
actually say it was like 30% or 40% mechanized,
mm,
unlike other coal mines or coal feed in the UK
mm.
and other part of the Western world already.
So with this conversation now, I feel it's very opposite, given that there's a lot of interest at the present in Nigeria's coal deposits. It feels like we barely scratched the surface in terms of mining the coal that we have in that whole Anambra Basin, from Enugu State all the way to Kogi, Benue, and what have you. The government has been talking about giving licenses to, you know, companies who are capable. On their website, Ministry of Mines or something. I
Mines
was on their
and steel
website some
development.
months. So yeah, I was on their website some months ago, and I saw like a call, an invitation to tender, something like that. Inviting people companies who are qualified to submit tenders to start to extract this coal. So the question is, how should you know, and maybe even who should be thinking about making sure that these coal mines are operating in ways that are humane. Because if you think about the way mines generally operate, I don't think I don't have a good picture of a mine in my head as a person I've driven past mines, I've seen pictures of mines, and there's the only thing that comes to mind is destruction. Because it feels like you're excavating the earth. It just feels like you just see a very big hole with ridges and stuff and all that. And you can see there's a lot going on here, but it feels like a lot of destruction. Much of it in quotes for our own good because we're extracting these things that are useful to us. But with all that in mind, environmental damage from the past and what's going on, who should be thinking about how we go forward from here in Nigeria and what kind of things should they be looking out for? Should they be talking about being fully mechanized, providing hospitals for the workers? I don't know. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, first and foremost, I think Nigeria has a lot of lessons to learn from their mining industry. So even beyond the coal mines in Enugu, of course, of the tin mines in Jos,
Just
which started operation as far back as 1909. Before we talked about Enugu coal mines around 1916. So I'll put this together and maybe react to your question.
yes.
So it's a good thing that the government is actually asking people to tender, bid of applications for mining these natural resources. However, I think it's like the government is putting the cart before the horse. So I don't know how much EAI, have been done around some of these mines, feeds, because a lot of damages were done during the colonial period. And I don't know if the government is thinking in that direction to see how they can reclaim. Because right now, almost every part of the world, or most part of the world, specifically like in Canada, I recently did a course syllable and one of the lecture notes on mining, environment, and national resource nationalism, sorry, was basically I actually saw where there were a lot of conversation around land reclamation. So most of the land that have been damaged by the mining company or by government, they are beginning to, reclaim them. That is to say, they are beginning to provide a sort of eco-friendly repairs and approach to those areas so that people could actually live in those areas once again. I think that should be the conversation with regards to the Nigerian context. I read something online where there's this particular community around the Iva Valley mine. People were complaining about a lot of them going blind even at early ages. And also, there's a lot of erosion occurring in the region because of the years of mining that have occurred in that area. I think this
And
should be
there's
the
waste that
conversation.
is produced with
Yeah,
that process, right? Chemical
yes,
waste and all that stuff that's
exactly. Yeah,
dangerous for
chemical
water that
waste,
people consume.
exactly. Water pollution, air pollution. These are things that the government should also bring into the conversation. So it's not just enough for you to actually ask people to tender application or their bids for this mining feed, but you also need to ensure that part of the agreement or part of what you should be looking at is a sort of clear, precise, workable proposals by these bidders that, okay, if we get this is how we intend to cut down on issues that have to do with environmental and
Environmental
health
impact.
issues. Yeah.
Mm.
So if we don't have this, it simply means we are going to re-expose people, particularly people living around the area, to more hazards. And on the global scale, I think Nigeria also needs to understand that mining coal is not really, I don't think it's bad. Let me use the word. I don't think it's bad because a lot of countries like Canada, Japan, China are currently mining coal. Even though there's this sort of conversation like, oh, coal is a dirty source of energy. Coal is not a
Yeah.
clean, it's not a renewable. Yeah, of course it is not. It's one of the
Mm.
most dirtiest source of energy, fossil fuel, right? And so
Hmm.
it has been shown to have a sort of global impact on the climate, situation. But I
Hmm.
also think that the government needs to be more concerned about how to ensure that environmental and health impact are drastically, drastically averted if we're ever going to have this coal fields, tin mines region operate again. Nigeria can make a lot of money from it, but we have to ensure that we don't do it the same way the British colonial government did it. We need not to. And how can we avert that repetition? The way we can avert it is to explore, to see the kind of conversations embedded in the colonial correspondence, the archival document. What were their findings? What measure did they propose to take, even though we know in some cases those proposals did not see the day of light? From that findings, we can actually map out a clear approach going forward. So I think that is what I would expect the government to do to ensure that whichever bidder is going to get into those places at the end of the day, they should have a clear cut, model on how they can actually
How
avert
they will
similar
manage it.
recurrence. Yeah, and
I
it's
agree with
unfortunate.
you. Go on.
Okay, yeah, go ahead. Okay, I think I also would like to point out that there've been a lot of cases of alleged illegal mining ongoing. Illegal in the sense that there are reports that, oh, these people mining this tin here or this school had some sort of approval from government. At the same time, we also read, oh, they don't have, they come in here, bribe 1 or 2 persons. We've seen the clips, we've seen videos, even in Zamfara. And it's not just about coal or about tin. In Zamfara, for instance,
With
one area
gold.
that is very gold. And you know what it means? Mining gold is not easy because of the cyanides, the chemical that
Yes.
are used in mining gold. And particularly alluvial gold, it can actually stream into the waterways. It can actually
Mm.
stream into the soil and create problem for us. So I think there's a lot of conversations we can have around mining. And one way of starting that conversation is to do what? To go back to history, to see what was done. And then we can actually start tracking it to the present to shape a better future. Because a man who does not know where the rain begins to hit him will definitely not know where the rain stops. So
Yeah.
I think there's need for that sort of connection to go back to the history book and see how we can correct some of the wrongs that have been made in time past.
I agree with you because in honesty, to some degree, regardless of whatever the intentions may have been, I think a lot of the work that were conducted under the colonial era, some of them at least came with environmental impact assessments to say this is how so and so things are being affected. For example, with the Telegraph, which I've been researching, I've come to realize that they were conscious of the damage to the environment that was being done as they were clearing pathways to lay the telegraph line. And so some reports will say that in a stretch of 1 kilometer going through the rainforest, up to 20,000 trees were cut. You know, that kind of thing. Some of them they would use as for poles for the wires. But what happened to the rest of the tree of that? Was it just used for timber?
Yeah.
And how do we maintain the environment? What happens to the farmland of the people, who just relied on that area for their economic activities, even if they were hunters, so to speak. But speaking about mining, it seems to me, even not just from what you've said, also from general understanding, that whole industry is shrouded in a lot of mystery. So we don't really know what's going on. For example, these tenders happen kind of like flying under the radar without it really being a very public debate that the government is trying to do, this kind of thing. Um,
Yeah,
the same thing applies to the oil industry as well, which is also mining. So because
of
it's
course.
shrouded in mystery, we don't know what's going on there. And then it tends to give rise to some of these social movements we've spoken about as well, where the people become
Exactly.
angry. They're like, yeah, destroying our land, you're taking our resources, you're killing us here. We have to stop.
But it didn't really start with even okay. Social movement issues in
Mm,
South. I like to use the word southeastern Nigeria because that was basically how it was described between
yeah,
1914 up until 1945, before Richard, the Richard Constitution came
Dr.
up and
Richards, yes.
provided regionalism, right? And then from
Mm,
1946, it began to be called Eastern Nigeria. So
yes.
I read Stein's work, Oil Exploration in Nigeria, in colonial
Mm,
Nigeria. And while
yeah.
reading the work, I actually observed that even though that was not her intent, but I could actually make out a sort of social movement ongoing by the NC party then. So
Mm,
Nnamdi Azikiwe and his fellow members were trying to caution the colonial government,
yeah.
particularly the Department of Mineral Survey, to be very mindful of how they explore certain villages, communities, because complaints kept coming in. You know how these things are done. Of course, I'm
Mm,
sure you know definitely that Oleobiri was not the first place where oil was found.
yes.
Definitely, even though it was the first place oil was actually
Commercial
explored. Yeah,
quantities.
well, exactly. So we already had the Wedra, discovering oil in Owerri
Mm,
presently at Wedra Road. But because
yeah.
the oil was not in commercial quantity, and you know what it means for you to actually start oil exploration at a particular point, it takes a lot of
Mm,
investment. So you need to ensure that whatever you're investing there, you will definitely get back the money and also get a lot of
yes.
profit. So you can imagine
There
how
was
they kept
exploration in
going.
Lekki as well,
Exactly. A
in
lot of
Lagos.
places they kept going, falling forests, you know, excavating the land, destroying people's farmland, exposing people to more erosion. In fact, sometimes I even try to think and argue if, because of the massive exploration of mineral resources that happen in certain areas in Nigeria, probably that's the reason why we keep suffering from, perennial erosion. There is no link whatsoever yet, but it was massive, it was dense. It was dense. The exploration was so much that the NCNC party began to write petitions and was trying to, kick against this sort of random, indiscriminate exploration of the
Yes.
region, trying to look for mineral resources. So I think, like you said, the mining industry in Nigeria is really, really shrouded in mystery, obscurity, and it can only take historians, very patient historians, who would take time to dissect bit by bit what transpired during this period to come alive with a holistic picture for our mining industry to move forward.
Thank you. Thank you very much. That's very profound. I'm curious to
Yeah.
know from your work, you obviously use a lot of oral sources. I saw that in a lot of your papers. What other kind of sources do you rely on? And maybe what kind of sources do you wish you had access to? For example, as someone who's interested in health and medicine, do you use the human body as a source? I've heard some people talking about using the body as a source, for academic research. Just curious to know what kind of
Like
sources
you
you're
mean
interested
physical
in and all
body?
that. Yes, the physical body. So maybe observing somebody's body to say as a result of maybe falling into the mine, that's why you have a gash. Yeah, and so everybody who falls into that mine has that. That's how we know them. So I
Well,
know that's just a joke, but
that is to say
just
I'm
curious about
almost
your sources.
becoming.
I know you use oral sources heavily, which tends to
Yeah,
be there's some tension about oral sources, right? People worry about accuracy and all of that. Not me, but just
exactly.
curious, about your thoughts on sources outside of oral, that maybe
Yeah.
you like to access and don't have right now.
Okay. So before I go towards talking about the kind of sources I would engage, let me just contribute a little to what you raised about the skepticism or doubts with regards to oral
Oral
sources. In
sources, yeah.
fact, that was one of the questions I actually responded to in my comprehensive, because I read quite a number of literatures, like the edited volume of Toyin Falola and Christian Jennings, right? And I also read out of Philip, I read out of Jean Vancina. I also read Louise White, Speaking with Vampire, Rumors, and African History. Quite a number of work to see how this conversation emanated and how they have flowed over time and what sort of reactions they have generated. So, with all these and what I have done in time past and what I'm also going to do, I think I can confidently say that no particular kind of source outweighs the other. Every source rather has their own shortcomings as much as they have their advantages. So whether it is written form, written primary or written secondary, there's also shortcomings and advantages. Whether it is oral, there's also shortcoming and advantage. But one thing I try to do is whenever I'm employing these sources, I'm not just concerned about the richness of the source, but I'm very much concerned about the credibility of the source. Doing my
Because
master's,
that's the main question a lot, right? The
yeah,
credibility.
yeah, the credibility, not the objectivity, not being objective now, but
Yes.
how credible. Because even John Vassina himself mentioned some of these problems. And I think it was James Giblins who tried to show us how, over time, the Maji insurrection had actually lost, or it had been, rebranded in a way that even the voices of the people are no longer being heard. So over
This
time,
was in Namibia, right? The Maji Maji?
yeah, yeah, as generation to generation passes the information, there's a tendency that they keep losing. Just like when you go to the archives, most of these papers are old. Every time they bring out an archival document for you, the document keep losing tiny particles of itself. And for the archival document, for me, I think they are a very good pointer when it comes to you venturing into colonial period. But we also need to be very careful about colonial document, because one, the question you want to ask is, who was the person who wrote this? Who was the person who compiled this? So during my master's, I came across intelligence report for the area I was working for that was written by F.A. Goodlife. Used to be an ADO, that's the assistant district officer, and later was
Okay.
moved to Port Harcourt area as DO. These guys, they post them. So basically, I read his compilation, his reports on the intelligence report of the area. But when I engaged oral sources, when I now went into the field, asking questions, interviewing, people who I found knowledgeable on those topics I'm discussing, I began to find some variants, some differences, particularly with regards to issues that has to do with marriage institution, for instance. I began to see slight differences here and there. And in some other cases, it could actually be worse, in the sense that some of those guys that were saying, remember, they were in a hurry, they had limited time to produce a particular document and forward to the appropriate office, who will forward it, to the next office. So sometimes they
Or
do.
they had a political agenda.
Exactly, and they were not even historians. Majority of them were either anthropologists who also were trained in ethnography survey, and sometimes they fail to understand because they fail to engage, ask. They just document what they witnessed, what they saw. They were not even like participating in the process. They were just observing and taking note. So we really have to be very careful. So going to your question, I have a collection of sources I'll be engaging. Basically, I'll engage oral sources, are really, really privileged oral sources in the reconstruction of that history of coal mining. Thank God, a lot of former miners are very much alive. I've been able to make headways to, get one or two or three persons. And someone have actually assured me that when next I come to Enugu, it will take me to where they have a lot of them. I intend to engage them, ask
Is
them for
this
their
coal camp?
experience.
Or they are not the
Yeah,
ones that live in coal camp anymore?
no, not the co-camp. I think the guy is saying like he knows a number of them because the guy's grandfather also worked in the coal mine, in the coal mine. So he knows a lot of people who actually worked, and they will also find other people. And also, I just don't intend to interview those who worked. I also intend to interview people whose fathers worked. who could actually tell stories on behalf of their father. So it's like a sort of
Yes.
oral tradition, right?
Mm.
Okay, because they were told what happened at the coal mine, or they saw what happened, and the rest of them.
Yes.
I also
Mm.
intend to really engage archival documents. They are very, very essential for my research. They will help me to understand how the colliery worked, what sort of infrastructure was in place, what sort of medical availability or otherwise. And I also intend to engage in field work. So basically, I will do sort of ethnography where I'll visit each of these um, mines once again. I was there once in 2015 when we went on an excursion. I think the Iva Valley, that was, but I didn't really pick. I wasn't very much particular or paid attention to the environment. I just went because,
Yes.
oh, I wanted to see where coal was being mined, and it was like
Yes.
um, part of an assessment. But this time
Mm.
around, going there, I'll have to pay attention to the environment, to the topography,
Mm-hmm.
and also look at other things. I also hope to, of course, use secondary sources to help me see how I can push the conversations from there. So
Yeah.
I'm going to, engage and mix up all these sources so that I can be able to
Mm.
produce a fine history on my
Yeah,
research interest.
interesting. I like how you say you're going to use even the environment as a source, and maybe you capture all of this in pictures and video, some of which
Yeah,
might show up in your work, to help people connect with the kind of analysis that you're making.
exactly.
Sounds
Exactly.
really exciting. Okay, so
Yeah.
just another minute or two, because we're almost out of time.
All
What
right.
can medical history tell us about the history of a people? So, for instance, in the course of your research, what are some of the interesting things you've learned about Nigeria, Nigeria's people, our culture, just from studying the history of medicine and health in Nigeria?
Yeah. I won't say I've really studied so much. I'm just at the very, I'm at the top level, but I hope to go deep. But I think one thing I have actually found with regards to medical history in Nigeria is every ethnic group that makes the Nigerian state today has a sort of worldview, cosmology, an approach
Mm,
towards their own form of medicalization. So I'll give you an
interesting.
example. I've been going through a couple of archival documents recently. In fact, up until yesterday, no, this morning around 2 a.m., I was flipping through some of the archival documents I recently retrieved. And
Mm,
I actually saw where smallpox have actually been existing in southeastern Nigeria. So when I say the word southeastern Nigeria, I use it in the context upon which Lord Lugard structured the country in 1914. So it
yeah,
includes present day South, South, and Southeast, and also three to
portions of
four
the,
provinces in Cameroon.
yes,
Yeah, that's the context in which I'm
Booyah,
using it. Yeah, Buya,
Amanda,
Cameroon, and Bamanda.
Mamfe.
So yeah, so basically, prior to the infusion of colonial biomedicine, every group had their own unique form of approaching issues of diseases and health. Take, for instance, among the Yorubas, they believed that Shokbono was like a god, a deity that
Mm,
inflicts people with the smallpox disease. And for you to cure the smallpox, you have to consult with the priest of
mm,
Shokbono. In the Igbo society, I'm here to know if there's any deity attributed to that. But I've seen where people actually attributed diseases to one deity or the other, no specific deity, but
mm,
they said, oh, it's like a curse from the
yeah.
gods. And beyond that, I also think one thing I feel very sad about in my little years of research on medical history is the fact that I would have expected okay, no, I didn't expect anyway, but I feel very bad knowing that when the colonial government came into certain regions in Nigeria, they found some sort of level of civilization in terms of our health and medicine. But
Mm,
rather than understand and support and maybe advance them, they crush them, forcing theirs on our people. There are records. In fact, I have a document where a lot of divisional officers were testifying of how they consulted with a native doctor. A native
For their
doctor.
own personal
Not
health
a witch.
problems.
Yeah, that's another thing I think most people miss. Not a witch doctor. There's a difference between witch doctor and native doctor.
Yes,
A
like a
native
traditional
doctor,
healer, right?
yeah, a traditional healer. And they were like, I have this archival document, not just one testimony, not two, not three. In fact, I think that was part of what I presented in the LSA last year, the Lagos State Association last year, where I talked about the issue of psychiatry, mental health, and indigenous knowledge. You
Yes.
could actually see how we had this sort of,
Did you discuss the work
unique.
of Thomas Adeoye Lambo? Because I know that he was working
Yes,
hard and
Lambo. Yeah,
using like local guys to work with his own Western practices to try and help people who had mental problems.
exactly. But I didn't really pay much attention to him, even though I know of Lambo as one of the leading figures in that area.
Yes, in psychiatry
But I
in
was
Nigeria.
basically focusing on Southeast because I had this particular case where a particular native doctor was petitioned. No, the division officer was petitioned that a native doctor have seized the wife of a man. And when the division officer invited or visited the man rather at his place, he engaged the man in conversation and
Yeah.
asked him like, "Hey, what is happening?" And the man was like, "Oh, I didn't adopt, I didn't kidnap. The girl was brought to me by the father because she has madness, and I've only tried to treat her." So the man asked her, "Okay, how are you treating her? How are you treating her?" So the man laid out the approach. The approach was keep the lady in a quiet, dark room. Don't feed her with any hot food. Give her cold water and place a sort of, I've forgotten some sort of herbs on her head from time. Oh, I think he actually scraped the head of the lady and place the plaster and go to talk to her. And so this particular officer concluded in his own word that that is more or less like what the Westerners will call, what's this word by Sigmund Freud now? Psychosis,
Therapy.
psychoanalysis. Psychoanalysis.
Psychoanalysis. Okay.
Psychoanalysis. That was what the man was performing. So you can imagine a Brit, a colonial official, evaluating a local, in quote, native doctor who had actually applied indigenous knowledge or traditional knowledge towards solving madness, and he equated it with psychoanalysis.
Analysis, yeah.
So I think
That's
there's a lot.
interesting.
Yeah, we had a lot. But one issue I also like to point out very quickly is
Yeah,
the fact that
of
one of
course.
the challenges traditional medicine or indigenous medicine in Nigeria had, or Africa generally, was the issue of secrecy. And that was one of the reasons why I can actually argue for the reason why the colonial government paid little or no mind in advancing it. Because a lot of these things were, kept in secret. Imagine Orodo community in Imo State, for instance. They were well known when it comes to orthopedic treatment. They are
What do you
well
call it?
known
The
to
Ikorodu community.
Orodo community
Okay,
in
Orodo, okay.
Mbitoli local government in Imo State.
Okay.
They are well known. In fact, there is a sort of general saying in Imo State: once you're trying to do something that would, put you in harm's way or break your arm or your leg, so they would say Ichoriga Orodo. So it's a sort of warning. If you break your leg or your arm, you go to Orodo.
You go
So, and I've
Orodo.
been following up Orodo. In fact, I traveled in 2019 to see if I can engage the community in a sort of conversation for interview. And my friend whose aunt is married in that area, they took me there, and the aunt and the husband told me point and blank that nobody will speak to me. That in fact, to show you how serious they are with this whole thing, they don't even, most of the priests, most of the bone doctors, that was the word they used, they don't even divulge the information to even their wives or their daughters. It is only one of the sons who will take the oath, and then they will start teaching the son. So it raises a lot of questions.
Yeah.
So it means that first, there is sort of segregation. We already actually segregated the women from the men in terms of knowledge transfer. Two, it could be that using the knowledge of bone setting and medicine, Orodo community could have actually negotiated with the upper hand within that society. So there's a lot of things. And I think secrecy is a major challenge why our health system did not really go far in those years. Unlike in the Western world or Western biomedicine, where, of course, everything is laid out, you see the process, you see the dosage and everything. But we cannot really say our traditional health system do not work. They do. When you read Abena Dove's book, roots, you'll see some of those conversations there on how a
Yeah.
lot of medicine we take in contemporary times we actually as a result of some
Mm,
of the herbs that were discovered by the colonial government in Africa.
yeah. It's interesting because even till today, we still have traditional healers, people who do bowl setting, people
Yeah,
who do even what you might consider surgery, where they open and remove one thing or the other. It may not always
exactly.
be
I experienced one last year, and
okay,
I can
okay,
actually tell you that for sure they worked. So I had this friend
yes.
of mine, the younger brother had issue when he was trying to. I think he was almost being robbed, so he was running. I don't know what he did, but the
Mm-hmm.
leg, became bad. I think he fell down. He was rushed
Maybe
to the
twisted his
hospital.
ankle or
Yeah,
something.
something of that nature. And the hospital recommended that they take him to somewhere. So when I went, there was actually a home. The man
Mm,
is a traditionalist, an orthopedic bone
mm,
setter. He sets bone. And the
mm,
man gave us his word that if we pay this amount, definitely we'll fix. And while we were making negotiation, we saw other people who came there who were receiving treatment. And I tried to engage one or two people, and they were like, when I came, my situation was worse, but I can now walk. Before I couldn't even stand and stuff like that. And believe me,
mm,
before I left Nigeria last year, this thing happened around April. Before I left in August, the guy called me and said that he's feeling better and everything is fine.
mm. So it really means there's a lot to learn. And as you say, one of the keys to unlocking all of this is actually history.
Yeah, history. There's no two ways about it. Although, even though
Yeah.
I know beyond history, other disciplines are also beginning to look into
Unnecessary.
this. Like you
Mm,
have medical sociology, you have medical anthropology. Yeah, we can all work together. We can all
mm,
work together to produce history. Of course, why it's the discipline of it will also have a lot of connection with other disciplines. So I think
yes.
the medical anthropologists, the medical sociologists, medical historians, we can all work together to actually bring a holistic conversation on how
Mm,
we can help better our situation in Nigeria.
absolutely. Absolutely. Patrick, thank you. Thank you so much for
Thank you,
joining me
Nandi.
on Nationhood podcast. I look forward to having you as a guest again.
No problem. I'll be expecting your invite.
So, friends, that was Patrick Okpaleke, a historian of health and medicine and a doctoral researcher at York University in Ontario, Canada. If you enjoyed the show, please give it a thumbs up and stay tuned for the next conversation. In the meantime, thank you for watching.